Okay, so this is frustrating because I just recorded the entire video and it didn't save successfully. So we're going to go ahead and do this again, like a bunch of friends. So first of all, what I'm using is our Arduino board, and I'm connecting the Arduino board to a Firefox or into Firefly, and then into Grasshopper, and then using the interface to actually manipulate geometry within the rhinoceros sort of realm. So let me just show you what a touchscreen is real quick so we know what's going on here. I'm going to assume that you all know what Arduino is. It's just a sort of piece of hardware, basically this background here. And the touchscreen I have is similar to this one. The one I have actually comes from a Game Boy. But what happens is that this screen plugs directly into the Arduino board, which is then plugged through a USB cable into the computer. So what my hope is to be able to manipulate the screen and use it to modify geometry within Rhinoceros. Okay, so without further ado, if you see my previous episode, it showed just sort of how we make sure that we're connecting the Arduino and communicating with Firefly. So let me just touch on this Arduino program I've set up real quick. Once again, we're doing is declaring integers, the x and y value. This is going to give us the values as you touch on the screen. It's declaring them as integers. We're going to set up a serial port. It's running at 38,400 baud, so it's actually faster than the last rate. And then that runs once, and then we run through the loop, which is actually like what's consistently being processed as the program runs. So first you set up your pins. The way that the touchscreen plugs into Arduino is through the analog connect. It's Y1 and Y2 plug into analog 0 and 2, and then X2 and X1 plug into 1 and 3 respectively. So the logic is a little bit sideways, but basically what happens is that when you set up the pins, we have 1 and 3 acting as input, 0 acting as output, and the digital write, when we say it's low, like I notated here, is that the analog ping 0 acts as a ground connection for the power, and then as we digital write it to high, pin 2 provides power to the screen through a plus 5 volt connection. And then finally, and like this is looping, so it runs through here linearly, the X value reads analog pin 1, which is actually providing the X value input as I touch the screen. And this pin set is set up the same way for the Y, except the Y value is reading it from 0. So finally, at the end of this loop, it prints to the serial port the X value, separates it by a comma, and then prints the Y value. This delay value, or this delay command, sets a refresh rate for the actual program. This is based in milliseconds, so 100 is 1/10 of a second. Okay, so that's the entire program. It's actually quite short and sweet, which is nice because I didn't have to go insane trying to figure it out. So let's go ahead and upload this, and while it's uploading, I'm going to go ahead and set up the Firefly over here. So once again, we should wow, I'm really zoomed out there. We should set up the ports, or check out what ports are available. So let's just plug a panel into here, and that's going to tell us that 3 and 4 are both available. So let's go check Arduino again. You should always check, make sure your Arduino board is correct. I'm running Arduino Villanove, and I'm running it through serial port 4. So this is telling us that 3 and 4 are both available. So we know it's already detecting those ports. So let's go ahead and open port 4, since we know that that's what's running. So the way the open port command runs is you have a boolean toggle value here, which when it's set to false keeps it closed. We have the port, which we know already is port 4. So let's go ahead and set that up as port 4. And if you remember, we had the baud this time set to 38,400. So let's go ahead and give it that value. Okay, so for the port closed, because the toggle is set to false, but we know the port is on 4, and it's running the correct baud. So let's just make sure that the port sounds kind of happy right now. It usually is pretty happy text. Currently closed. You must select it on. Hooray! Serial port is open. Alright, so we know the port is working, and we know it's reading. And now that it's uploaded. It didn't upload correctly because a different file I've opened is currently accessing the COM port. Okay, good. I've closed it since then, so now we're uploading it. Okay, so as you might recall from before, the next step is to try to read the serial ports. We're going to do it slightly differently this time. Alright, we're done uploading. So let's just make sure that it's reading those values and it's actually running actively. Right now we have 38400 set correctly. If you have the baud set incorrectly, it's going to give you a bunch of garbage. So we're going to make sure this is set correctly, and it's going to feed us these series of data points. This is just sort of like the passive level of the board, but once I touch like approximately the center, it should both go to around 500. So we can see it's pretty close to the center because the limits are set to 1000 and 1000. So we know the board is running correctly. We know the COM port is reading it successfully, and so that should be good for us to know that Arduino is working. So let's get the Grasshopper to go ahead and pick up that data. Alright, before I showed you how to read directly from the Uno board, what I'm actually going to do this time is just read directly from the serial port. And what this is going to do is just let us read that straight data. We already know that's only the X and Y value that it's outputting. So this setup is fairly similar to the open port setup, so let's just go ahead and run this real quick. We'll go ahead and copy and paste it. We don't want to turn it on yet, so we'll leave this at false. That's fine. Port is still 4. Timer is another Boolean value. Basically what the timer does is tells you whether or not to repeat or whether or not to refresh the input. We're going to want it to, so we're just going to set this to true. And once again, that input is based on milliseconds, so let's just go ahead and run it at the same speed as we have the program set it to. So it's going to refresh every 10th of a second. Alright, so currently the message should tell us that the ports are closed. Yep. So we need to open this port before it's going to be happy with us. Now it's telling us it's open, so let's run this. And now it's reading values. Alright, so what values is it reading? Let's go ahead and find that out real quick. We'll grab another little panel here. Input is null because I've turned off the port, and I have turned off the read. Turn this on, it's ready to read, and we're getting those X and Y values. Let me just test it by touching the board. Yep, once again it's responding to my input. So we now know that we successfully have communication between the Arduino board and Firefly. Alright, so this is good. It's refreshing it every 10th of a second. So if I move this fairly quickly, you can see there's a fairly quick response as I move my finger across the touchscreen. Okay, so our next step is the way I've set up my Grasshopper is I've created a grid of points, and I've actually flattened those points. So right now I'm able to input a value, and it'll modify the point that you're affecting. And the point on this grid is a surface, and as you increase the value, it'll modify different points. So you can see there's already this grid system running right here, and that's because, like I said, I just re-recorded this, so we actually have open in a different window. No, we don't, but something that's creating that grid of points. So it's actually a different Grasshopper that I have open right now. Okay, so we have this going on. So what we're going to do first of all is parse those or split the string so we can get the X and the Y separately. And then we want to turn those into values which are sort of on the same domain as my grid. So first of all, let's go ahead and split that, and that's going to be so it's happening. That's going to be a string split command. And we're going to split it based on the comma, because that's how we're delineating. If you remember, I set it up in Arduino to put this comma in between the X and Y values. So that means I can just go right here, throw in a comma, and that's going to be our delineator. Bam, there's our string, which means that the output is going to separate those into the X and the Y. And once again, we're seeing that it's responding to me touching the screen. Okay, So the next step is to just grab one of those values. So we're going to do another split. But this time it's going to be a split list command. So we'll go ahead and plug in the list. The index this time, we have the 0 and the 1 on the index. The index is going to be 1 because we want to grab that value from here. So we'll have the x and then this is going to be the y on the screen. So since my Grasshopper is set up only to sort of be able to read one dimension at a time, we're going to just grab the x value out of here. And testing once again, it does respond to me touching the screen at a rate of 1/10 of a second refresh. Alright, but let me go ahead and open up the Grasshopper file which I have set up, which is a surface file. And what I've actually done is I set up a rectangular grid which sort of creates a series of points, flatten them, and I'm sort of like able to use a slider to modify the index point to, and this is a real mess, but basically what's happening is that it's creating this grid that we were looking at before, and as I modify the slider it runs through the series of points linearly. So right now this is a one-dimensional sort of interface. I'd like eventually to be able to work with both x and the y, but for now I've got it set up just for the x. So you can see the range here is between 1 and 54. So if we go back to this, we're running between 0 and 900. So let's go ahead and just bring that down, go into the math set, bring it down to a range which makes sense for our values. So we're going to let's just set it to 1 to 10. So go ahead and input our string, and then we're going to use 100 to divide it down. Alright, so that's going to give us the output. I'm just using all these panels so we can see like every step of the process. It's giving us the values at a much closer scale, but since we're running as integers, let's just add a little integer filter here. And that will, as you all know, drop it down to integer. So as I move my finger across, we're just going to get whole numbers here, integer values here. Okay, so we've got this Grasshopper screen set up, and it's set up to accept integer values which run across this grid based upon their the value of the point. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that into my Arduino sketch here, or my Firefly sketch here. We're no longer going to need this slider, so we can let me make sure everything stays on the screen here for you. We can disconnect the slider, no longer need that, and instead of that we can actually plug through Firefly, we can plug the Arduino directly into that screen. So let's move this to the right. So what you're seeing now is that I'm actually able to, by touching the screen, modify the surface based upon these points, which is and the points based upon where I'm touching on the screen. So this is where our project stands right now, and like I said, I would like to be able to move this in both an X and a Y direction rather than just an X direction. So if you guys have any suggestions on how to sort of clean up my Grasshopper to be able to just create this series of points and be able to modify it in both the X and the Y direction, I'd really appreciate it. I'd be very happy to talk about it. But right now we have a successful integration between a Game Boy touchscreen and Arduino, the Firefly, through Grasshopper, and finally into Rhinoceros.